The city of San Francisco wants to make it easier for tenants to form unions and stop paying rent. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's coming out of one of the most progressive, tenant-friendly, anti-landlord places in the entire country, San Francisco, of course. And it shouldn't surprise you that things are very, very different for landlords in the city. So this article, what it has to deal with is basically the city of San Francisco is trying to make it easier for tenants to form unions, okay, and then give those unions certain rights over the landlord. Okay, and it's absolutely crazy because those rights really are just them stripping more property rights away from the people who rightfully own the building. And this goes for people who own buildings as small as 5 units. So it's not exactly like they're just talking about large corporate landlords here. You know, these tenant unions could essentially bankrupt a small landlord who owns a small 5-unit building, and the city is doing absolutely nothing about it. But before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below, and let me know what you think of tenant unions, okay? So from what I've read, tenant unions will go in, and if there's something that the landlord is doing that they don't like, they will just do a rent strike and stop paying rent. And then, come on, how do they expect a landlord to, for example, fix a problem if they're not getting any rental income? Okay, and there's no recourse for these landlords either, especially not in a place like San Francisco. So they can't evict these tenants or do anything about it once they go on their little rent strike until they, work something out with them and beg them, oh, please start paying me again. Well, you know what? Taking the property rights away from owners, completely ridiculous. And I'm glad this kind of nonsense doesn't happen outside of, these very, progressive cities, okay? So, this article comes from therealdeal.com, and it says, San Francisco landlords face pressure as city pushes union-like protections for tenants. Yeah, union-like protections for tenants. So they're going to go on strike and they're going to organize and, okay, whatever else, okay? I'm not a fan of unions. In fact, I hate unions, okay? I'm just going to be honest with you. So I believe that they are actually hurting most businesses. And just like this is a similar situation where the tenants will actually hurt the people who they need to help them, okay? So let's get into the article and see what it says. San Francisco has once again thrown its support to tenants over landlords. In a legislative first, renters could get union-like protection from the city as landlords face penalties for failing to acknowledge and meet with them, according to the San Francisco Business Times. Supervisor Aaron Peskin introduced legislation this week that would require landlords to formally acknowledge tenant associations and meet them as many as 4 times a year. So the landlord has to formally acknowledge this tenant union, okay? Now, I don't know what exactly that means, but you have to meet them 4 times a year. Why am I taking time out of my busy day to go down here and meet with these tenant unions, okay, so that they can demand that I upgrade their building even though I don't have the money because of San Francisco's rent controls? Oh, just kidding, but you get the point, okay? We're talking about tenants coming in here. If they have a gripe with their landlord, here's what my suggestion is, right? They send a letter or email or give your landlord a call, tell them what the issue is, right? And if the landlord doesn't fix it, then there's a inspection process. There's processes in place in their city and with the landlord where you don't have to have a union. If something's not fixed and the city doesn't help you fix it, then leave, okay? When your lease ends, leave. But no, these people, they feel like they have the right to stay in these properties forever. And this is part of my issue with rent control. The tenants just won't go. They won't go. Oh, I have my rent-controlled rent, and I'm just going to stay here forever. It's going to be 30 years from now, and I'll still be living in this 1-bedroom unit. Well, that's not the way the rental market works anywhere else, okay? Usually there's a lot more turnover in a normal market, but rent control puts an incentive in place for people basically to never move. And that's, basically what's causing these situations. So now we have these people who have this incentive to never move, and now they feel like they have this control over these landlords. And if the landlord doesn't do exactly as they say, be it keeping their rent low, be it, giving them the upgrades they want, then they just go on rent strike, okay? They're just like, no, we're just not paying rent anymore. And the landlord has no recourse of removing them. So, yeah, I mean, this is a ridiculous situation, but of course it's going to happen in a place like San Francisco. The move would apply to all buildings with 5 or more units, and the penalty for noncompliance could be rent reduction approved by the San Francisco Rent Board. Harassment of a tenant association, taking down posted flyers, or disallowing associations to meet in common areas could invoke similar penalties. The legislation applies to both rent-controlled and non-rent controlled buildings. Peskin called the effort groundbreaking and remarkably simple. He said the change comes from the storied playbook of labor and has the support of tenant groups and the Northern California chapter of the Services Employee International Union. Well, I don't care what tenant groups or what union supports this kind of ridiculousness, because it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So if they passed this part of the law is the harassment issue, and it says that if you take down a flyer for the association, then the tenant board can just reduce your rent, can reduce the rent for the entire building. So they can take away the landlord's money just because you took a flyer down. Does that sound lawful? Does that sound like an unconstitutional taking of private property without just compensation? Does that sound like a Fifth Amendment violation? Because that's exactly what it sounds like to me. But believe me, it's going to be a rough time if you tried to sue over that, So I just hope this law doesn't even pass. San Francisco already has tenant associations, like the one organizing a debt strike against apartment manager Veritas Investments. Yet under current law, landlords have no legal obligation to acknowledge or meet with these groups, and no financial incentive to do so. Tenant associations are and would be voluntary, but under the legislation, a simple majority of tenants would need to sign on in order for the penalties to go into effect. So so the penalties would go into effect if a simple majority agrees to join the association. So here I am, I'm a small landlord, I own my 5-unit building, and 3 of my tenants decide, hey, we're going to form this tenant association, right? And then they're like, okay, well, we demand that you meet with us and then negotiate the rent to be lower. And I'm like, no, I don't want to meet with you. They can say, oh, that's harassment. You harassed us. So they report me for harassment, and then the government says, well, we're going to reduce your rents from now on. So I can't even pay my mortgage now because, think about how ridiculous this situation is. And, the politician who's trying to get this passed, who put this whole thing in place, he has no clue about running a business. He has no clue about the pettiness of some tenants, and he has no clue just how difficult it's going to be to make this work for a lot of landlords out there, okay? If approved, the ordinance would become effective 30 days after its passage. It further stipulates that lease agreements entered into or amended after January 1st, 2022 must acknowledge tenants' rights to organize. The legislation is one of many tenant protections introduced by city supervisors in the weeks after California ended its eviction moratorium and disallowed a local provision that would have extended the moratorium through the rest of 2021. Supervisor Dean Preston, the first Democratic socialist elected to the board in 4 decades, recently called for his district, which includes the Height, Coal Valley, and Western Addition, to be an eviction-free zone. Well, it says right in, his party, he's a socialist, okay? So he wants socialism to come, and landlords are just, screwed with people like this in power. So obviously, I don't agree with any of this proposal at all. It hasn't been passed yet. Wouldn't surprise me if it does pass. We are talking about San Francisco here. But yeah, just keep in mind every little thing that they do. They think that they're passing these great laws that are protecting tenants and all that, and they have the opposite effect. Okay, they make housing more expensive. They make the place more unaffordable. They make it harder to find rentals for the people who need them, and the result is that the only people who are going to be left are the extremely large landlords who can deal with all of the hoops that they have to jump through because they have the staff and they have the emergency reserves, etc., to just power through it. So sorry for any small landlords out there that have to deal with this mess, but like I said before, I would never invest in San Francisco or California at all, okay? It's just not worth it to me, not even with that extreme amount of appreciation they get.